so far, and then kind of a roadmap on where we're going. So I'll hand it off to Meg and the others to have them introduce themselves, and then we'll get started with the presentation.
Yeah, hi everyone. Nice to see folks joining. And this is a lunchtime webinar on purpose. So if you're joining, feel free to be eating your lunch, and we'll be guiding you through a talk about Spokane County's experience with extreme weather and climate impacts. So as the slide shows, I know those of you who live in Spokane County are already experiencing things like wildfire smoke, wildfire, and other. So an opening icebreaker question is for folks joining, if you're able to, please share in the chat. We'd love to hear a name of who's here, where you live or work, or somehow your affiliation with Spokane County, and extreme weather or climate impact you've experienced. So at any time, feel free to pop that in the chat. We will be using the chat box to get your input throughout today. So would love to hear from you all. Oh, I see. Sorry, an attendee is telling me that it's not letting her put anything in the chat. So how about, is anybody wanting to share verbally? And I would be happy to call on you. If I can, you can raise your digital hand. Like that. And maybe Graham, I'll call on you for an example at the moment. Are you willing to share about extreme weather event or climate impact you've experienced?
Yeah, yeah, I can kind of kick us off. Uh, like I said, Graham Zickafoos, work in the planning office, Spokane County. Extreme weather event would probably be a couple years ago during the Gray Fire. I lived over in Eagle Ridge at the time, and I could see the water planes swooping in over my neighborhood and out to Medical Lake.
Thanks, Graham. And folks, yeah, if you send something in the chat it'll send to hosts and panelists, we'll just copy and repaste it for folks. That'll be how we handle the messaging. So I reposted from Carly, joining from Gonzaga Climate Institute, Linnell, and our team will just keep an eye on the chat, and that's how we'll redo it. Or we may have updated it to share with everyone. So we're figuring it out on the fly. I also want to introduce ourselves. You already heard from Graham Zickafoos, who introduced us, and Scott Chesney is also involved in this project as planning director for Spokane County. And then our team includes myself, Meg Horst, as well as Carson. I want to give away Carson and Taylor from Cascadia Consulting Group. And we have the privilege of working with Spokane County and helping them develop their first climate element. So our plan for the day, for this hour, is to tell you a little bit about what it means for Spokane County to have their first climate element, and really are here to share early results from our climate vulnerability assessment and hear from you all. So we'll have kind of moments throughout, just like now, where we ask for your input. So feel free to chime in. It's meant to be a bit interactive. And by the end, we'll share some next steps. So for folks who may or may not know about what a climate element is, a climate element is, so Spokane County is required to include a climate element in their forthcoming 2046 comprehensive plan update. So shown in the purple box here, and you're required by the state of Washington through HB or House Bill 1181 to add that. So one thing your climate element will do is be compliant with state requirements. And then the other boxes show other reasons that we think it's great for Spokane County to have a climate element. And one is, as the yellow box shows, that it helps the county be more resilient. And by that, we mean be able to adapt to changing precipitation, heat, wildfires, et cetera. And other benefits of preparing for the impacts of climate change include economic stability, environmental stewardship, and public health, among others. And I just want to share that the Department of Commerce, which is requiring jurisdictions like Spokane County to have a climate element, puts forth in the left is a screenshot of their cover page. They put forth a 100+ page document with guidance for Spokane County and all other jurisdictions. And we at Cascadia have read this guidance very closely, and we are adhering to what Department of Commerce requires of you. But if folks on the call are interested, you can find that on Department of Commerce website. They also provide other tools shown on the slide, and that includes an emissions forecasting and scenario planning tool, as well as a climate policy explorer, which is full of lots of ideas for climate policies. So we at Cascadia access and use these tools, and they're kind of behind the scenes today to inform the future climate element. I just want to give a little update. That I think the chat box looks like it's working for folks. I see Megan Pinch was able to share, and other folks have been able, Bernie was able to share. So if other, feel free to keep introducing yourselves in the chat. Just name where you live or work in the county and any particular climate impacts or extreme weather events that you've experienced. And just a little bit more about Spokane County's climate element. Again, this is a requirement from the state that the climate element will actually contain two sub-elements. On the left in red is reducing climate pollution, or in other words, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the state has multiple requirements there, but Spokane County will be expected to have policies about removing or reducing emissions from transportation, buildings, and other sources. Also to expand walkable neighborhoods, bike infrastructure, and other ways for people to get around besides needing to drive. And number 3 notes that all the focus on pollution reduction has to include policies that prioritize and benefit overburdened communities. And I'll say more about that in a minute. So shown there in the Venn diagram, kind of some of the icons. We're really going to be focusing more on the right side of the slide today, preparing for building resilience. So Spokane County will be preparing for the hazards that we'll talk about today, like flooding, heat, drought, and wildfire smoke. Also protecting, enhancing green space and natural areas, and helping everyone prepare and stay safe. And that includes those who are most vulnerable. And again, I'll share more about that. So that's where the climate element is headed. Oh, and sorry, I'll just back up to say, and today we're mainly again focused on climate resilience, but I do want to share a few brief highlights about the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, or what we also are calling carbon pollution. So before I dive into that, I know we have a lot of folks joining who are really familiar with climate work and greenhouse gas emissions knowledge. And so I'd like to ask folks joining, what do you think is the biggest source of carbon pollution or greenhouse gas emissions in the boundaries of Spokane County? I'll pause. And there's a little icon that might be a hint at some of the answers. Carly's got a guess, transportation. Well, we've got multiple folks guessing transportation. And so I think they know something, because that is correct. Move to the next slide here. And Cascadia completed a pretty in-depth greenhouse gas emissions inventory for Spokane County. I'm only going to share really high-level highlights today, but if you're interested, Graham Zickafus, you can connect to him and get the full inventory. But this slide is showing a bar chart that shows the primary emissions in Spokane County. And you are right, the transportation guessers are right, that vehicles, on-road vehicles or transportation is the primary source of carbon pollution, as showed in this purple box. It's the largest box, and that comprises about like 30% or so of greenhouse gas emissions. The second biggest category is buildings related, and in Spokane County that comes from both natural gas for heating, for example, and electricity to power houses and commercial buildings, things like that. This is pretty common for jurisdictions in Washington state, that transportation and buildings make up the majority of greenhouse gas emissions at the local level. There are, of course, other sources, and they're indicated here in this bar chart, and that includes loss of tree canopy, agricultural production, although that varies depending on what the production methods are, refrigerants, marine vessels, not as relevant to Spokane County, but rail, aviation, so use of planes, off-road equipment, industrial sources, and wastewater and solid waste related. So there are a number of areas in which Spokane County can focus on reducing its emissions going into the future. But in terms of most bang for the buck, if you will, the transportation and building related ones are ones that we are going to be focusing on going forward. And I mentioned earlier, there's lots of multiple benefits to Spokane County's climate element, and specifically on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There's lots of benefits besides simply contributing to the global project of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And some of the most important ones are that it improves local air quality, which is particularly important for children and seniors, strengthens health and safety, reduces noise pollution, and is just generally a form of resource conservation. And here's some, and another big one that really matters to me and many people in Spokane County, I think, are lowering household costs. So today we're not really focusing on this aspect. I just wanted to preview it for attendees. And we're going to be focusing more today on the resilience side of the climate element. And so now I want to take us into sharing some highlights from our climate vulnerability assessment. And so just a quick preview or overview of what a climate vulnerability assessment is. It provides a local level analysis of climate vulnerability, supports the development of goals and policies, and can be an educational resource that folks can share around. So we at Cascadia have drafted about 100 or so page document full of maps, charts, data, photographs, and stories that tries to tell the story of where Spokane County is facing some climate vulnerabilities. I'm using that word a lot today, climate vulnerability, and I just want to share a little bit more about what we mean by that. So here's what looks like a nice math equation on the slide. And it's not quite as simple in real life, but it's a pretty good simplification of a complicated concept. And basically in our detailed report, we're looking at exposure, so the degree to which Spokane County is experiencing certain climate stresses, plus sensitivity, the degree to which the system's likely to be affected, and I'll give an example in a minute. And then we try to consider adaptive capacity and get at a score of, or a overall assessment of vulnerability. So for example, exposure might be the amount of risk of future wildfire happening in the county. Sensitivity could include the number of houses that are in wildfire sensitive or prone areas and their level of exposure to that, the number of houses and who's living in them, for example, and their ability to evacuate or prepare. An adaptive capacity could include a consideration of how prepared are local fire departments to respond to fires, how prepared are local homeowners to reduce the vegetation near their households and initiate kind of fire responsive or preventative measures. So taking all that into account, we can have some sense of that particular type of climate vulnerability in Spokane County. So in our forthcoming report, we tried to look at this across a range of climate impacts. So this is probably no surprise, but in Spokane County, the key climate impacts we've identified after looking at lots of tools, including the University of Washington Climate Impact Group's tools, and also talking to a lot of key stakeholders, include rising temperature. So Spokane County is expected to have higher temperatures, over a 9.5 degree increase by the year 2100 from the early 2000s, and especially high temperature increases during the summer months. So that's a pretty big increase. Also in red, wildfire and wildfire smoke. Again, this is probably no surprise to folks joining, but we anticipate increased wildfire activity and risk due to heat and drought increasing. And regardless of whether there's nearby wildfires, also increased wildfire smoke events could be coming from as far away as Canada and California. And those can include a higher concentration of pollutants, which can diminish local air quality. In green mentions changes to precipitation patterns. So we anticipate for Spokane County more winter rain rather than snow, and reduced summer precipitation, particularly affecting the Spokane River and other river tributaries and affecting agriculture. And then the far right box suggests stream temperature, stream flow, and flooding. And so we expect changes to precipitation patterns with increased winter stream flow due to the precipitation changes and decreased summer stream flow. And that could affect, of course, salmon and other animals that use the river. So next, after assessing all these climate impacts, we tried to assess how do they affect Spokane County in different communities and different people. We looked at a bunch of plans and reports. Here's a few. I won't go into detail about them, but we looked at a lot of, and Spokane is lucky to have a lot of really great actors and organizations who've produced a lot of great research. So it was fairly easy for us relative to other places to get a good grasp of what's already known. And we complemented that through some community engagement that's ongoing. So Spokane County has about a 20-person climate policy technical advisory committee with members of local jurisdictions, staff from Spokane County, members of nonprofit leadership, folks from utilities and from tribes who bring their insight, and they helped us better understand Spokane County's climate vulnerability. We also participated in community workshops in the wintertime, both focused on rural and more urban parts of Spokane County. We've had one-on-one discussions with partner towns, and that includes smaller towns like Waverly, Leyte, and Cheney, and others. And then this webinar is another way. And we'll be launching a community-wide survey probably as early as next week, so stay tuned on that, and that'll be a great way to hear from a broader range of community members. The photo here is showing one of the posters we had at an event in this winter. So all that together brings us to the background, or now I'm about to get into the details of the vulnerability assessment. A little background context. The map on the right is simply showing the large geography of Spokane County. So in pale yellow is the large county, and then in the black outlines show some of the cities and towns that exist within the county. And so a point I want to make here is our vulnerability assessment attempts to cover this large geography, including rural, agricultural, and forested areas, wetlands, natural areas, as well as these more urban towns and centers. So that can be a challenge because not every part of the county will experience the same climate impacts, but we'll try to give you a flavor of that through a lot of mapping and kind of on the ground perspectives. And on the left here, we're required by the state to bring attention to frontline or vulnerable residents. And what that means is those who are expected to be impacted first and worst by climate change. So some examples of communities in Spokane County, these are populations that are at a higher percentage in Spokane County than they are statewide. So residents over 65 years old, around 18%, under 5 years old, about 5%, residents with a disability, about 12%, and residents at or below the federal poverty level, around 12.5%. And you can probably imagine why these folks may be extra vulnerable, but just as one example, the first one, folks 65 and older tend to be more vulnerable and impacted by heat and smoke events. For example, in the 2021 heat dome, most of the deaths that occurred across the Pacific Northwest were of seniors and older folks. So that's one example why we give extra attention to them. Our vulnerability assessment was organized in 4 different sectors or categories. So Taylor, Carson, and I will be walking through highlights according to health and well-being, environment and water resources, and built infrastructure. I won't read aloud the rest right now, but this can give you a sense of how we're organizing our assessment. And then the bottom row suggests that we also, in the vulnerability assessment, are giving attention, one-on-one attention to each of these participating towns and cities mentioned here who are contributing and partnering with Spokane County on this climate vulnerability assessment. So we take an in-depth look at them. Although we won't be sharing much of that today because we're staying at a pretty high county level. So now I'm going to pass it to my colleague Taylor to talk us through the findings for health and well-being.
Great, thank you, May. Yeah, so health and well-being, the subsectors included there include public health and social vulnerability, community resources and emergency services, and occupational well-being. If you could go to the next, thank you. So public health and social vulnerability, extreme heat, wildfire, and wildfire smoke are already affecting the physical, mental, and community health of county residents. Socially vulnerable populations, such as children, older adults, and those with pre-existing health conditions, are at a higher risk for heat and wildfire smoke impacts, as well as other climate impacts. But we really took a look at heat and wildfire smoke for the county. For example, children are particularly susceptible to heat and wildfire impacts due to their developing physiology and their reliance on adults for health and safety needs. So in the case of wildfire evacuation, they're reliant on the adults around them to help them get to a safer environment. Additionally, older adults are more likely to have pre-existing health conditions that may worsen during heat or wildfire smoke events. Spokane is already seeing these extreme heat impacts to the community. For example, Meg mentioned the 2021 heat dome event. The county had 19 reported heat-related deaths in the county, and most victims were in their 60s and 70s and often had pre-existing conditions. Increased annual temperatures and the frequency of extreme heat events are also likely to compound wildfire smoke events. And you can see this map on the right. We have an overlay of a heat map for the county and the presence of older adults. And you can see that there are some more rural areas that are likely to see higher impacts and a higher relation to older adults. If you could go to the next slide, please. Great. And looking at community resources and emergency services. These resources and services, such as schools and education facilities, libraries, hospitals and medical facilities, police and fire stations, and first response services, play an important role in the county's overall community well-being. During extreme events and weather emergencies, they provide services such as medical care, resource coordination, and can support crisis response. These same facilities may also be impacted by climate change, potentially limiting their services and operational capacity. Heat-related events lead to more emergency calls and can place additional strain on emergency and healthcare services. Again, during the 2021 heat dome, there was a 17% increase in call volume compared to the previous week for Spokane Regional Emergency Services. Many community resources and critical facilities are centrally located within the county, which can leave service gaps for rural residents. And you can see in the map to the right, again, we have critical facilities and wildfire exposure in the county. We also have a map that delineates the different facilities included in the map, but generally you can see that many of these facilities are located in the middle of the county, leaving some gaps of service that also have high wildfire exposure. Wildfire is also straining fire resources in the county, with Spokane Fire Department noting that 2024 was the department's busiest year ever, and an increased risk of wildfire and continued strains on department's resources are likely to worsen. Aging or deteriorating buildings or those with outdated HVAC systems are particularly at risk for heat and wildfire impacts, and community centers in the county have observed increased visitation during smoke events, which makes reinforcing these spaces important to promote community health and resiliency. Next slide, please. Thank you. Sorry, just grabbing my notes. Okay. Approximately 19% of Spokane County's workforce is employed in outdoor occupations, such as construction, agriculture, and outdoor recreation occupations. Outdoor workers face higher risk of heat-related illness, which may be worsened if they're required to wear heavy protective equipment, such as firefighters or agricultural workers spraying pesticides. The outdoor workforce is mostly comprised of men and has disproportionately higher populations of Hispanic, Latino, and African American individuals compared to the workforce as a whole in the county. In addition to personal health and safety risk from heat, wildfire, and smoke, outdoor workers face potential lost earnings from reduced labor hours. The projected lost earnings for outdoor workers across the US by the end of the century is upwards of $107 billion under the higher emission scenario. Next slide, please, Meg. Thanks. In addition to lost workforce hours, economic impacts can span to different industries such as the outdoor recreation industry. So shifting weather patterns are likely to affect outdoor recreation economies as well. Decreases in snowpack are projected to shorten ski seasons between 27 to 62 days, which can lead to up to a $1.3 billion economic loss annually across the US. Additionally, reduced snowpack and summer precipitation are likely to affect stream flow and reduce the summertime flow rates, which may negatively impact rafting and kayaking activities in the county. And yeah, so thanks, Carson. So yeah, please share or raise your hand, noting, does this climate VA reflect your experience? And if you have any other examples of climate impacts to share related to health and well-being.
Yeah, Lunel, I see you have a hand up. Let's see if we can hear you. Might not be. Sorry, Lunel. We're using.
I think.
Oh, go ahead. Maybe we can hear you now, Lunel. Oh, think I just saw you unmute. Go ahead, Linnell.
This is a funny factoid. Spokane has more gardeners than almost any place per capita in the country. There's an economic impact of this climate change as well as a recreational impact. And it would not be out of the question to include gardening as one of the recreational activities that will be curtailed, and certainly the plants that we are growing.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, and seeing in the chat change in fishing regulations to de-stress heat stress species. And yeah, we definitely talk about rivers and wetlands in the next section, which I think kind of touches on fish a bit, but good to note for recreation as well.
Yeah, and I see the comment by Bernie about change in fishing regulations. I'll note that right now we're sharing climate impacts and vulnerabilities. And we also did take a look and considered the existing adaptive capacity, which is a bit of a wonky phrase, but how prepared is Spokane County? And we'll get your input at the end about ideas for Spokane County. What is it already doing and how can it be better prepared for all these? So Bernie, I think your input is a little bit about like how to deal with heat stressed species like fish. And there's another chat too, home insurance being dropped. You hopefully can see that our team is taking your notes real time on the slides, and we will use these to inform our update of this analysis and also to inform policy development going forward. So thank you. I think I'll take us to the next section, and like Taylor just led us through, we're each going to share and then pause and ask for input. So be prepared, be thinking about your input as we go. And feel free to always put something in the chat at any time. I'll take this one on environment and water resource. Thank you, Taylor. So in this part of the presentation, we'll focus on natural areas, parks and trails, water resources, and agricultural resources. And you probably all know this, but Spokane County is really special because of its wide range of parks, open space, and trails and conservation areas. There are 48 different ones with really remarkable ones like Turnbull Wildlife Refuge, the Saltese Wetlands, Spokane River, and the Centennial Trail. And, depending on where they are and their susceptibility, they may be at risk for impacts from drought, changes in snowpack, wildfire, and heat. So we'll try to look at some specifics here. So thinking specifically about wetlands, here's a photo of the Saltese wetlands, and then there's a map on the right, which in green shows identified wetlands in the county. And there's a lot of them, particularly in the southeast portion, but also up north around Deer Park and a bit to the right near Spokane Valley and Liberty Lake. And the map is showing it's just a point in time look at snowpack drought, and that's when there's below historic normal amounts of snowpack, which can then lead to summer drought. So the map shows that at this point in time, there was a well almost 80 to 100% below normal. And this can have an impact on wetlands because they don't replenish and fill up, and then they'll dry out earlier, which can impact both the animals and fish and birds that live in or use wetlands, but also recreation and any food or other resources that humans use from the wetlands. I also want to talk a little bit about river flow changes, because one thing that makes Spokane County really special and why I have my background here is both the Spokane River and other rivers and creeks that go through the county, and they're major sources of recreation, fishing, and they're just important cultural resources for Native Americans and for all residents of Spokane County. So the photo on the left comes from Spokane River Keeper. And I'm sure if you live there, you've noticed changes in flow in the river. So we just have a chart here showing that from the blue line there shows historic, or from 1971 to 2000 Spokane River flow, which you can see is has historically been at lower points through the fall and then increasing throughout winter and peaking in May and then declining again. And that's going to change looking forward to the orange and pink lines, which will mainly mean more river flow earlier around like January, February, March, April, and then diminishing in the summer month, with much lower flow in the summer, and that's related to the changing precipitation. So as Taylor mentioned earlier, that can affect kayaking, but it can also affect where fish have, the fish's ability to survive in summertime, and other plants and animals as well. Spokane County also has a lot of great trails, and sometimes those have climate impacts. Pictured here is a flood in 2017 impacting the Centennial Trail. Trails also can be affected by extreme heat. Not pictured, but I have spent time on some of your great trails, and they don't all have shade on hot days. So when you get extended temperatures above 90 degrees, it can be difficult for many people to want to use or be physically able to use the hot trails when there's sun pounding down on them. So those are some examples of impacts to recreational and ways that people just get around. This slide focuses on water resources, and there's a lot of content here. On the right shows basically the connection between some of our climate impacts and Spokane County's water resources. And by that, I mean snowpack and river levels and other water resources that replenish your drinking water, agricultural water, water for irrigation, and et cetera. So, when there's higher temperatures, that means more evaporation of water, which can lead to more intense storms and bigger snow melts. And then more snowpack melt leads to less water infiltrating into the soil and aquifer, and less water in our soils means our front yards or agriculture dries out. So people tend to increase their summer water use, which can impact the overall water availability or lead to rising costs of water and contribute to summer drought and fire. And then that can all lead to lower summer river levels, and you kind of get in this cycle. So that's the main overall view. And in Spokane County, a thing to note is that you're a growing county. So your critical water supply is already experiencing pressure from over 500,000 plus people. And there's expected population growth in the region, so that will increase water demands. And then certain industries also use a fair amount of water in the region. So important consideration of climate impacts going forward. And I'll also talk briefly about agriculture, which is a significant part of the local economy and also the landscape and cultural identity of Spokane County, particularly the Palouse area, for example. And it's a significant economic generator of over $500 million annually. So many households benefit from agriculture. And agriculture faces climate impacts, including and not limited to drought and precipitation shifts, which I've already talked a fair amount about. It's important to note that most of Spokane County farmland is non-irrigating, meaning it relies on rainfall to ensure that the soil is moist enough for the particular crop being produced. So the map on the right in red shows existing agricultural lands, and as you can see, really it's a big part of much of rural Spokane County and all over the county to the north, south, east, and west, outside of the towns, really. And the brown underlying layer is the same one shown earlier in the wetlands map, which is showing snowpack drought in a particular year, and snowpack levels being well below normal, which also is an indicator of summer drought. So not a lot of spatial variability across the county, but a point here simply is that agriculture in the future will probably be increasingly challenged by drought. And also wildfire risk can be a risk to agricultural lands depending where and when fires happen, and if that impacts farms as it did in the past. So yeah, I see somebody already participating in the chat. I'm excited to read it. And our question to you is same as we had before, is does our assessment of impact to environment and natural resources and water resources, does that reflect what you experience in Spokane County, or do you have other examples to share? Let's see, I am gonna check. I'm gonna repaste, somebody shared something that I think oh, there we go, Carson put it on the slide. It is essential that natural areas be connected throughout the county. Any break in a migration or conservation path. Yeah, we didn't talk a lot. I mentioned about animals a number of times, but your natural areas, going back to that map, not all are well connected. And as climate impacts increase, such as fire and heat, the connection of those is even more important to enable, for example, moose or deer to seek more food sources or cooler areas to be able to go up in elevation. etc. So there's some good examples. Anybody else has anything to add about environment and water resources? Well, we'll go to our next and final section before we have an open discussion about action. So I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Carson.
Awesome. Thanks, Meg. So yeah, now moving on to the built infrastructure section. This section will be covering housing, transportation, and energy within the vulnerability assessment. And we can get moving on to the next slide. So the first thing that we're going to cover today is housing. So Spokane County is growing, as many of you may know. More people are moving to the county and more housing developments are being built and expanded into less populated areas. As urban sprawl continues, more homes are being built in higher risk areas like wildfire risk, which puts both people and housing at increased risk of housings being damaged or destroyed or people being displaced due to wildfire. This is a map to the right that our team created that shows wildfire exposure risk in urban growth areas and indicated through housing densities. The red indicates direct exposure, which you can see that there's definitely a lot of red in Spokane County, and then orange indicates indirect exposure, and yellow is not currently exposed. The map suggests that a lot of the housing supply in Spokane County is vulnerable or exposed to wildfire risk. And then just wanting to note that just because there's, some areas of orange and yellow, that doesn't mean that wildfires will never happen there. They're just historically have been less exposed to these risks. We saw a huge increase in housing being destroyed in the 2023 Gray and Oregon Road fires. These fires burned over 20,000 acres and destroyed 366 homes within the county. Someone mentioned this in the chat about raising insurance prices, but that is also something that is happening with housing specifically as well. Most of the survivors of the fires were underinsured for the damages that were caused on their homes, and many policy limits were reached, which leaves a whole nother aspect of housing vulnerability, which is the insurance aspect of it. And then another major risk to housing is extreme heat. So when it gets super hot, Spokane has a pretty large inventory of older housing. So 38% of Spokane homes were built before 1970. Just using kind of some statewide and historical data that, older houses tend to not be as well insulated and also don't have potentially access to AC as often. And then in a 2022 study, Gonzaga found that 44% of residents have unreliable or no access to air conditioning, which can be put people at risks if they're, not able to stay cool in their house and don't have potentially anywhere to go specifically. And then just want to note too, like AC data is very hard to find, but we know that by looking at, Washington State in general has some of the lowest AC rates in the nation. So looking to hopefully have the county expand, AC units within different units as we move forward. And then going to the next slide related to housing, briefly talk about flooding. So flooding is also a risk for the housing supply within the county. About 9.6% of properties in Spokane County have some risk of flooding within the next 30 years. And then 1 inch of rainwater can cause up to $25,000 damage. So definitely not can cause a pretty penny in damage. And flooding isn't just a future risk, it's already happening. Recent floods have impacted areas along the Spokane River, the Little Spokane River, Layton, Hangman Creek, and then communities like in Peaceful Valley have already experienced raising river levels, and homes have been threatened by water as those waters have reached 28 to 30 feet in the past. And then this picture here, just noting that this is from a 2014 flood in Spangle that happened. So that's a quick overview of the housing, and we'll go into the transportation section of the built infrastructure section, the county is a large county. The transportation is really essential to get people to their daily things like work and to see family and to get key services and meet their daily needs. Climate hazards like flooding, wildfire, and extreme heat can significantly impact road infrastructure and limit mobility, especially if people are walking or biking or taking bus routes. And then they can also delay any type of emergency response by making certain areas inaccessible to first responders. So if we start with flooding, local floods can be caused or have been caused by heavy rainfall and also snow melt, which can wash away asphalt, erode road beds, and then shut down key routes for either hours or days, especially in low-lying areas near creeks and rivers, leaving those particularly vulnerable to flooding impacts. And this year alone, Spokane has seen around 4 million in additional road repairs that need to be done because of recent flooding events causing damage to specific roads and culverts. And then wildfire is also a major threat to the county. Fires can damage the roads directly, but they can also damage roads by causing closures and traffic disruptions. They can strain other routes that aren't meant to be as high capacity. For example, in the Gray Fire, sections of I-90 and State Route 902 were shut down, rerouting all that traffic that would be on those roads to State Route 904. And then which is in heavily affected areas, full road reconstruction or slope stabilization may even be required. So not only can wildfires close roads, but it can also harm the construction of the roads. And then extreme heat, especially in urban areas, are also impacted by road integrity. Not as common as flooding or wildfires, but roads treated with chip seals are particularly vulnerable, especially in high heat due to the emulsion that can liquefy, causing condition called surface bleeding. This leaves the pavement soft and sticky. Which can create safety risks and additional wear and tear on the road, especially for newer roads. This is more common in more urban areas, but can still happen on those super hot, like 100-degree days. And now we'll go into the last section, which is energy. So Spokane's energy and transmission infrastructure is facing growing threats from wildfires and extreme heat. Also due to the increased demand of power. So power lines, especially lower voltage distribution lines, can spark fires, particularly during dry or windy conditions. Also, if trees have low-hanging trees, it can ignite those. In recent fires, they have been already linked to utility equipment, so it already has been causing fires in the past. There's been some mitigation techniques being done to make sure that using public safety and using power shutoffs during dangerous weather are able to make sure that those potentially don't catch fire. And at the same time, Spokane's growing population means more home, means more electricity use. Higher temperatures mean more people are using their power, which can cause power outages, which puts significant pressure on the system. We've already seen hydropower output drop due to potential drought and early snowmelt, and this can extreme heats can also lead to the damage of electrical equipment. So there's many ways for these power outages to happen, especially during wildfire and extreme heat events. And I think that's it, just very briefly for the specifics on built infrastructure, but we have the same question as before for the last two, and we can go through these comments. I see one of them already in the put on here. See if I can read it. Some of these issues should be addressed through building codes, etc. AC, yes. So I'll be quiet so we can see if anyone has any comments, either verbally or written. All right. Well, since there's no comments, feel free if you're still writing, or if you come up with anything later, can you cut and paste the whole comment? Yes. Can Taylor or Meg, do you want to, can you? Perfect.
Taylor's on
Thanks.
it. And there were a couple other comments about pine bark beetles and sorry, I'm reading through it all. Okay, I think that one is the one, the full comment, and about the wetlands and absorbing. And I think Taylor's grabbing those and putting them in the natural environment. So we are capturing them.
Perfect.
And
Thanks so much, Meg. Okay. And then on to the partner town previews. This will be just very, very brief. But like Meg said earlier, we are doing some town one-pagers as a part of this climate vulnerability assessment to kind of dive deeper into the specific towns and areas within the county. If you want to go to the next page, that would be great. So for these individual one-pagers, we'll be doing it for Cheney, Millwood, Deer Park, Latah, Spangle, Fairfield, Rockford, and Waverly. And this will be a one-pager that will address 1 to 2 key climate impacts. So wildfire, flooding, drought, extreme temperature that can be specific for the local community, and we'll be looking into the vulnerabilities of local assets and the local communities for each of those, and we'll create 1 to 2 maps or types of figures or visuals for each specific city or town. And if we go to the next slide, this is kind of just an example of what we would be kind of looking at. So using the town of Cheney as an example, climate risks like wildfire and wildfire smoke, as well as extreme heat, are 2 climate risks that are present that in the largest and most urgent risk for this city. The town one pager, we might discuss local assets like Eastern Washington University, Cheney's local businesses and growing businesses opportunities areas, as well as the National Wildlife Refuge that is nearby. So this is just a quick example, but if you want to see more of that, we can definitely share that out as they're created in the future. And next slide. And I think it's back to you, Meg.
yeah, we just got another comment in the chat about program insulation from an employee of Vista. So that's a perfect segue because throughout we've been sharing about climate impacts and vulnerabilities. And some of you have been bringing up what could be done about it. What can Spokane County at the government level and also at the local community and household level do? So that's what we want to spend our last little time together focusing on. So I want to open it back up to what can Spokane County do to be more resilient in the face of all the climate impacts we've mentioned. So this slide has organized by the 3 sectors we shared: health and well-being, environment and water resources, and built infrastructure. And we put a few example actions in here. So under health and well-being, having cooling centers where folks can go during extreme heat. I think there are some already in the county, and there may be opportunities to expand that. Adapting outdoor recreation, for example, expanding mountain biking, kayaking, et cetera, into shoulder seasons where there may be cooler weather and more water flow. Under environment and water resources, we have water conservation and regional coordination management to reduce drought and forest thinning to reduce wildfire risk. And built infrastructure, some people touched on this in the chat, but building and development codes that require or encourage energy efficiency, fire buffers, and air filters. There definitely were some more comments in the chat that are relevant to this. So we'd love to hear other ideas you have that Spokane County or other actors are already doing that we should know about or that you want to see. So go ahead and put it in the chat, or if you raise your hand, we'll be able to spotlight you and unmute you. And Carson or Taylor, are you able to copy that most recent comment into? Great.
Yep. It's included in built infrastructure.
Great. I will call people's attention to, there's a comment from Luana in the chat that had some ideas about kind of more specific ideas about building codes. For example, air conditioners are simply a heat transfer device, so having more of them just puts heat outside. Requiring them doesn't improve the situation as much as better insulation. And the commenter provided an example of their house and how they're able to, and also another idea around considering light pollution. And somebody's going to share about some climate change presentations coming up. So maybe more in the community education and empowerment side of things. Yeah, I would love to hear that, Rayanne. Please do put a link to share. Dylan, Carson, are you able to enable Dylan to speak, or was that Taylor who did that last time? Can you make it happen? All right, Dylan.
All right, yeah. I'll just briefly bring a perspective from the transportation sector, looking at built infrastructure. In the county and especially in the kind of more suburban or exurban areas, we have some communities that tend to have kind of one way in, one way out. And so looking at building more in a structure that has, if not a gridded, at least a connected street system, helps with situations like needing to evacuate if there are nearby fires. It allows people kind of multiple points of exit and entry, both for emergency responders coming in and residents or folks who work in those areas leaving.
Thank you, Dylan. Yes, and in our analysis, I know we looked at a lot of aerial footage and maps of neighborhoods in Spokane County, and many of them do not have what you're talking about, which is like multiple points of entry and exit. So puts them at higher risks. I think you bring up a really great point about multiple evacuation routes, which can also help have other benefits too of enabling perhaps more walking, biking, and active transportation options too, and reducing car-oriented. Anybody else have any ideas you want Spokane County to be doing or that it is already doing that you want to share and amplify? Just giving it a minute. And Rayanne did share a link in the chat, and then also Liana shared about Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance about doing a building stock assessment and offered a link. So we'll take a look at that for sure. And anybody interested in building stock analysis should take a look. And also here's a link to that in Gonzaga event. So thanks everybody for sharing. And I'll just say a little bit about thank you. And I've seen some more things coming in. Again, shared a link to the insulation program that Avista runs. And I'm going to just reshare a chat that I think just came to us to make sure it's shared with everybody. Work with local tribes on environmental aspects, especially fuels management using traditional ecological knowledge. Somebody else has an idea about moving away from lawns and into native plants. These are all great ideas. Let me back up a sec. We're trying to capture them real time here. And if we didn't capture it in front of you, don't worry. We're going to take everything from the chat. And if you unmuted and spoke, we're going to make sure we capture that and have it all. And we'll use it to inform and update our vulnerability assessment. And we'll bring it into the goals and policy making phase. I don't know, we have a couple more messages coming in. This is great. Yep, somebody talking about aquifer protection area and education and some more events. So what's happening next? Well, as I mentioned, we're going to take your input and update the climate vulnerability assessment. As Carson mentioned, we're working on the one-pagers for each of the 8 participating towns and jurisdictions. So you will see in early fall that Spokane County, with support from us at Cascadia, will publish the final vulnerability assessment, and that can be a great educational tool. We'll have both like the long, lengthy report and also a shorter public-facing version that could be easily shared around. We also are still looking for more community input, so we'll be having a survey. We're sharing a survey. It'll be live about next week sometime. It'll be in English, Spanish, and Russian with a hope to engage folks who speak Spanish or Russian and might not normally get engaged in Spokane County planning efforts. So stay tuned for a link where how we found out about this webinar. You probably can find a link to that survey. So that'll be another way for us to get input. And then we'll be working with the Climate Policy Technical Advisory Committee to draft the climate element, which I discussed earlier, which will have goals and then policies or actions for the county to do to be more resilient in the face of climate change and to reduce carbon pollution. So if you want to stay in touch on it, there's a link to the county's webpage. Graham's right there. Graham can wave maybe. So you could contact Graham Zickafoos, Assistant Planner at Spokane County, with questions and to stay engaged. And with that, I really appreciate folks attending today and for your participation in the chat box or unmuting. Thank you. You all are thanking us, but thank you. We're delighted to be working with Spokane County. And I should mention that in the lower right comment or icon here, that this has been funded by Washington State's Climate Commitment Act. So an appreciation for voters and legislators in the state of Washington who prioritize climate action and have a Climate Commitment Act that is funding and supporting this important work and will hopefully go on to be available to support implementation too. So thanks all for joining us during your lunch break, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Take care.
And I will stop screen sharing. I believe I recorded. Pause, stop recording. Stop recording.